Do not look away. What you are about to hear is not meant for you. And yet, if you are still listening, it means something inside you has already been chosen. Imagine this. A crypt sealed for decades is opened by trembling hands. Lantern light sweeps over rows of coffins, the air thick with dust and incense that never fully faded. One by one, the lids are pried open, and inside, instead of decay, instead of the twisted marks of death, the faces of the dead are smiling. Wide, serene, almost mocking smiles fixed in waxen flesh. Nuns, holy women of Kentucky in the year 1892, lying in their coffins with expressions not of suffering, not of grace, but of knowing. Smiling as though they held a secret no one dared to speak aloud. Before we go further, I want you to do something small but powerful. Like this video, subscribe, and comment where in the world you're watching from. It matters more than you realize, because history always takes on a different shape depending on where your eyes are placed. And as you listen, remember, you are not just hearing history. You are letting it shape you. What is a smile in death? Across cultures, across centuries, it has been seen as the most unnatural of all parting gestures. Death stiffens, death distorts, but rarely does it leave behind the serenity of amusement, the cold elegance of laughter frozen on a corpse. When these coffins were opened, the nuns' expressions were taken as a sign of holiness, proof of incorruptibility, whispers of sainthood. But if you trace back further, through forgotten rites, through the long corridor of the church's shadow, you find another truth, a darker one, the kind that turns piety into theater, ritual into weapon. Smiles and death have always been symbols of a pact, an agreement sealed long before the final breath was drawn. And this is where our descent begins. Kentucky in 1892 was not the Kentucky of today. It was a land caught between frontier violence and industrial order, superstition and Catholic discipline. Orphanages, convents, reformatories, they were not places of mercy, but fortresses of control. Girls who entered rarely left unchanged. They were reshaped, hollowed, turned into vessels. The nuns were the wardens and the servants both, bound to vows, bound to silence, bound to rituals so old their meanings had rotted away. But something in that convent, something buried beneath its stones, never rotted. It waited, and when the sisters finally passed, it revealed itself not in screams, but in smiles. We must not make the mistake of thinking these stories are isolated, quaint footnotes of Catholic eccentricity. No, they are fragments of a much larger design, one that stretches from medieval Europe to the New World, from monasteries carved in a mountain rock to the hidden archives beneath Vatican floors. Death smiles are found in frescoes that predate Christianity itself. They appear in Egyptian tombs, where mummified priests show the same impossible curvature of the mouth. They appear in the catacombs of Rome, where anonymous martyrs grin like they have glimpsed the joke no one else understands. Why does the Church so carefully call these incorruptible relics? Why do they parade them in glass cases, candlelight flickering across embalmed lips that seem seconds from laughter? Perhaps it is not holiness being preserved at all. Perhaps it is the evidence of something else, a ritual so deep in human history that even to name it is to call it awake again. But in Kentucky, the story sharpens, because these were not martyrs of antiquity. These were women whose names we still know, whose diaries, if you can find them, still bear the heavy scratches of confession. And in those pages, scrawled between psalms and penitence, you will find references to the white silence, to the hour of joy, to the gentle visitor. Harmless phrases at first glance, until you remember that in every forbidden religion, every cult that dared rival Rome, Joy was not innocence. Joy was the mark of sacrifice accepted, a smile not of peace, but of surrender. The convent had been touched by something, and when the nuns died, they carried that something into the grave. That is why the villagers who first saw the smiles did not cheer. They crossed themselves, yes. They whispered prayers, yes. But they also pulled their children close because deep down they understood. To smile in death is not to be blessed. It is to bear witness to something on the other side of the veil and to bring that witness back with you. And so I must ask you, if you were to die tonight and your body was to be opened by strangers a century from now, what would your face show them? Would it twist in horror, sag in emptiness? Or would it smile, as though you had seen a truth you dared not share while alive? That question is where this story begins, but it is not where it ends. Because the truth behind the nuns who smiled from their coffins is darker, older, and closer than you can imagine. And it did not stop in 1892. It never stopped. The convent in Kentucky stood like a fortress of brick and prayer, its windows narrow, its halls echoing with hymns that could never drown out the silence beneath. In those years, religion was less comfort than command. Obedience was the gospel, and the walls themselves seemed to absorb the whispers of those who doubted. The sisters who lived there were not free, not truly. They were bound not only by vows, but by rituals so subtle they looked like routine. The ringing of the bell at night, the placement of candles in odd numbers, the insistence on smiling during certain processions, all of it, stitched together, resembled something more ancient than Catholicism, something that echoed from older temples where gods were fed not with prayers, but with silence and joy. The year 1892 was when the veil thinned. Historians record it as nothing more than a cholera outbreak, sweeping through towns and convents alike. The nuns fell one by one, bodies drained, yet their faces not twisted in pain. Witnesses described it with unease, sisters lying in their beds, lips curling upward as though they had just been told a secret so gentle, so devastating, that it bent them into permanent amusement. Death was slow, and yet, when it came, it left beauty where there should have been ruin. The priests who arrived called it miraculous. The doctors who examined it called it inconclusive. The villagers who saw it called it cursed. You must understand the psychology of the time. In the late 19th century, America was still reeling from its Civil War, still haunted by mass death, still hungry for signs of holiness in a fractured land. To discover smiling corpses was to find proof that God still lingered in the ruins. And so the church leaned into the narrative. The convent became a place of pilgrimage. Coffins were opened again and again, the air thick with incense to disguise the rot that never came. But not all the bodies were incorruptible. Some decayed as expected. It was only the select few, those who had been part of the inner circle, those who had taken part in the hour of joy, who smiled. Think of that phrase, the hour of joy. Records describe it only in fragments. A midnight vigil, candles placed in a circle of 13. Hymns sung not in Latin, but in something older, something phonetic, as though copied without translation. At the climax, the sisters would kneel, and one among them would begin to laugh, soft at first, then louder, until it spread like contagion through the group. Laughter in the dead of night, echoing through the halls until it spilled into silence. They called it joy, but joy can be a mask. Laughter can be surrender. And in the silence after, something always moved through the convent, unseen yet undeniable. Diaries describe it as a visitor, gentle, white, smiling. So when they died, is it any wonder that the smile remained? The ritual was not a performance. It was preparation. Death was not the end, but the seal of a pact already made. The visitor had marked them, claimed them, and in exchange, given them incorruptibility. The church saw saints. The villagers saw a curse. But those who looked deeper understood. It was neither miracle nor punishment. It was participation. Participation in a pattern older than faith, older than civilization, a pattern where those who smile in death are not gone at all, but waiting. Do you feel it yet, the unease creeping behind the edges of these words? That unease is the first crack, because once you begin to notice, you will see the pattern everywhere. Smiling mummies in ancient crypts, grinning skulls carved into cathedrals, even modern corpses embalmed for display, lips curved unnaturally by morticians, as though the smile itself is demanded, repeated, perpetuated. It is not superstition. It is signature. And in Kentucky, in 1892, that signature was burned into the memory of everyone who saw those coffins. But there was one sister, one exception, whose body told another story entirely. She did not smile. Her face was twisted, lips peeled back in terror. She alone resisted the hour of joy. And for that, the convent buried her quickly, without ceremony, without mention. Her name was Sister Agnes, and though her journals were seized by the church, fragments remained in the hands of her family. In those fragments, she wrote of nights where shadows bent differently, of voices that entered her mind and spoke in plural. She begged to leave, begged to escape the ritual. And perhaps that is why she died as she did, contorted, fighting something the others welcomed. If the smiling nuns were evidence of a pact, then Sister Agnes was evidence of the cost of resistance. And in her defiance lies a truth more chilling than the smiles themselves. That joy was never the choice. It was the command. The smile was demanded, and when it was refused, the punishment was not decay, but terror. And so I leave you with this thought, one that cannot be answered easily. What is more terrifying? To smile in death because something has claimed you, or to twist in horror because you resisted and lost? Both fates lay in those coffins, and neither has ever truly been explained. The story of the smiling nuns could have ended there, embalmed in rumor and church propaganda. But history has a way of refusing silence. The convent kept meticulous records, or so they claimed, and within those records lies the unspoken architecture of their rituals. Financial ledgers disguised as hymnals, margins filled with coded notes, names scratched out and replaced with symbols, half-suns, crescents, eyes that seemed to look back at you from the page. These were not accidents. They were blueprints. The church presented the smiles as miracles, but the sisters themselves had been architects of something they could barely understand, a structure of rites built from fragments stolen across centuries. When pilgrims came to view the coffins, they were led through a narrow corridor where the air grew colder, though no wind passed through. They described an odd sensation, that someone was watching them, not from the coffins, but from behind them. The smiles, they said, were not directed at God or heaven, but at something just over the visitor's shoulder, something you could never quite turn to see. Children cried and pulled away from the coffins, while adults, desperate for holiness, forced themselves to stand still, to gaze upon the dead until their eyes watered and their throats tightened. More than one visitor fainted. The priest said it was awe. The villagers said it was presence. And if you study presence across religions, across occult history, you find a constant. The body remembers when something stands too close, even when sight and sound deny it. But let me ask you, what kind of presence leaves joy instead of fear? Or perhaps the question is crueler. What kind of presence teaches joy as the mask for fear? This is the cruel genius of ritual. It reshapes terror until it feels like ecstasy. It turns submission into pleasure, chains into gifts, and death into laughter. And when the nuns lay smiling in their coffins, they were not mocking the living. They were revealing the final lesson, that their fear had been rewritten, converted into joy so complete that even decay could not erase it. Diaries uncovered in private collections, rare but still breathing with truth, mention a figure described not as Christ, not as Mary, but as the teacher of white silence. He came to them not in sermons, but in shadows, speaking without voice, instructing without words. He smiled, one nun wrote, and in his smile we felt both wound and healing. Another wrote, he asked for nothing but our laughter, and so we gave it, and he sealed us in his. Do not dismiss these as hallucinations. Group ecstasy, repeated over years, creates patterns stronger than steel. And what is religion, if not the repetition of a pattern until it outlives those who created it? Now, pause and imagine this. Midnight in that Kentucky convent. The sisters kneeling in the chapel, candles flickering. A hush so thick that even the rats scurrying through the walls freeze in place. Then one sister begins to laugh. The sound breaks the silence like glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. Another follows, then another, until the chapel is filled with women convulsing in holy hysteria, faces glowing with something both terrible and beautiful. And in that laughter, they claim, the teacher of white silence entered. Not seen, but felt. A smile pressed upon them, reshaping their very bones. And when they died, they carried that smile to the grave. This is not miracle. This is not curse. This is initiation, a preparation for what comes after breath stops. The nuns were not waiting to meet God. They were preparing to become part of the visitor's silence, part of the smile that has haunted humanity since the first temples were built. And if that thought unsettles you, let it. Because unease is recognition, and recognition is the first step toward seeing what has always been there. But one detail haunts the story most. Not all the nuns smiled. Some resisted. Some were buried in haste, their faces twisted. Their names were erased from the ledgers, their existence smoothed over by official history. Yet resistance leaves a louder echo than obedience. Those who smile became relics. Those who resisted became whispers. And whispers, once heard, never leave you. Let us move deeper, past the coffins, past the rituals, into the psychology of what it means to smile when you should not. Science would have you believe it is nothing more than rigor mortis, a tightening of muscles, an accident of decomposition. But if it were so simple, why does it appear selectively, persistently, across cultures and centuries? Why does it haunt the margins of sacred history, like a watermark the church cannot erase? Why do the dead who smile always belong to groups bound by ritual, secrecy, and silence? Consider the incorruptibles displayed across Europe. Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, her lips curved faintly upward, eyes closed as though savoring a secret. Saint Catherine Labour, the same. In each case, the church insists the bodies are miracles, but in private they whisper, because they know the history. They know that beneath the marble altars and golden reliquaries lies a thread too dark to name aloud. A thread that binds Kentucky in 1892 to Paris in 1879, to Rome in the 4th century, to Thebes long before Christ. The smile is not holiness. It is signature, and signatures, once recognized, cannot be unseen. The convent diaries speak of fear transformed into joy. Psychological conditioning, perhaps, or something stranger. Modern psychology tells us that the human mind, under extreme pressure, can invert its emotions. Fear becomes laughter. Pain becomes ecstasy. But when dozens of women across years, across generations, repeat the same inversion with the same result, smiling in death, it ceases to be psychology. It becomes ritualized metamorphosis. They were not conditioned by man. They were conditioned by something else, something patient, something that had been waiting for centuries to carve its mark upon new soil. What do you think happens when a human being laughs at the very moment terror should consume them? What doorway does that open? Indigenous tribes once spoke of laughter as the sound that confuses spirits, a way to cross thresholds unharmed. In medieval grimoires, laughter is written as the key to summoning. And in occult manuscripts buried beneath Vatican floors, there are instructions for binding joy to silence, a phrase too close to Kentucky's hour of joy to dismiss. To laugh where one should cry is to invert the natural order. To smile where one should rot is to carry that inversion into eternity. But here lies the most unsettling truth. This was not confined to the convent. Villagers who attended the funerals began to report strange dreams. They dreamed of the sisters smiling at them from across rivers of mist. They woke laughing, though they remembered nothing funny. And when they returned to the chapel to pray, they felt the same presence watching them. Not the presence of God, but of something that thrived in their unease. Smiles spread like infection, subtle, insidious. Even children were said to giggle in the night, their laughter echoing with tones too low for their small throats. The convent was no longer a house of the living. It had become a factory of silence and joy, producing not saints, but signatures. And yet, the church did not close it. They expanded it. They invited more sisters, more orphans, more pilgrims. Because to admit the truth would be to admit that the line between miracle and horror is thin enough to disappear. Better to sanctify, to declare it holy, to drown it in incense and hymns until the darkness is disguised as divinity. That is how institutions survive, not by destroying the forbidden, but by absorbing it, repackaging it, and selling it back as holiness. But I will tell you what the villagers already knew, what the whispers already carried. Holiness does not smile from a coffin. Only something else does. And once you have seen it, once you have felt that gaze just behind your shoulder, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unfeel it. And you will never again trust a smile in death. There is something strange about how history handles these stories. Official records smooth them, iron them into neat miracles. The church claimed the smiles of the Kentucky nuns as incorruptibility, divine proof that their lives of suffering had been rewarded with eternal peace. Pamphlets were printed, pilgrims flocked, money flowed, but the raw truth, the unedited witness accounts, tell a story that cannot be sanctified. Because when the villagers described the coffins, they spoke of more than smiles. They spoke of teeth, glistening and too perfect for women who had lived on hard bread and well water. They spoke of lips that seemed to moisten as though freshly alive. Some swore the bodies shifted when no one looked directly at them. A hand tilted, an eyelid quivered, the faintest sound of breath escaping a throat that should have been sealed in silence. You may think this exaggeration, but pause here. Ask yourself why so many reports of incorruptible saints and smiling corpses repeat the same details. The body does not rot. The skin remains smooth. The expression is serene, mocking, eternal. Coincidence is a weak explanation. Patterns this old are not accidents. They are instructions. Someone, or something, has been guiding these rituals for centuries, shaping them into a design that survives long after the participants are dust. The smiles are not random. They are signatures left for those brave or foolish enough to look closer. Imagine yourself in that chapel in 1892. The air stale, the candles dripping wax into uneven pools. The coffins opened, one by one, until the smell of wood and incense blends with something else, something sweet and metallic, like blood left too long in the sun. And there, face after face, smiling at you, as though each one knows exactly what you are thinking, as though they are waiting for you to join them. Could you stand there and not shiver? Could you look into the curved lips of the dead and not feel them pulling at your own mouth, coaxing a smile from you in return? That is how infection works. Not through touch, not through bite, but through mimicry. And once you begin to mimic, you're already halfway claimed. But the convent did not just display their dead. They guarded them. Night vigils were kept by priests who prayed loudly, as if to drown out something else whispering in the silence. Witnesses describe how the shadows in the chapel bent strangely, as though the candle flames leaned toward the coffins instead of away. At times, people swore the smiles widened ever so slightly when hymns were sung off-key. If you understand ritual, you understand this detail. Spirits feed on imperfection. Flawed hymns, broken prayers, laughter where there should be silence. These are not mistakes. They are offerings. What chills me most is the psychology of the sisters themselves before they died. Letters found decades later reveal a strange duality. On one page, a nun writes of her joy, her bliss in serving the visitor. On the next, she confesses to waking each night in terror, heart pounding, unable to breathe until she forced a smile back on her face. He does not like frowns, she wrote. He teaches us to laugh, and when we laugh, he is gentle. But when we do not, the silence grows heavy, crushing. That is not sainthood. That is conditioning, the training of prisoners who learn to smile to survive. And when death came, their masks never slipped. Their obedience became permanent, their smiles etched into their very flesh. Now, think again of Sister Agnes, the one who refused. Her terror was not in vain. It was clarity. She saw what the others could not. Or perhaps she dared to admit what they all knew but smothered with forced joy. She died in agony, but her face told the truth. It is easier for history to erase her than to confront her warning. But the whispers of her family carried her name, carried her defiance. And in her defiance, there is a key, a reminder that joy can be demanded, but it cannot be trusted. So the convent became both shrine and prison. Pilgrims came to see saints, but the villagers walked away shaken, muttering that the smiles were wrong, that they were not for the living. And perhaps this is the heart of it. Those smiles were not directed upward, toward heaven. They were turned outward, toward us, the ones who still breathe. They were invitations. They were promises. And if you're listening now, you have already stepped closer than most ever dare. It is tempting to believe the story belongs only to Kentucky, locked in a year most of us barely remember. But if you pull on the thread, it unravels a tapestry that stretches across continents. The smiling dead are not anomalies. They are part of a lineage, one that has appeared again and again wherever power and silence converge. Look to the mummies of Guanajuato in Mexico, many of them grinning with lips pulled taut across their teeth. Look to the medieval catacombs in Palermo, where children preserved in glass coffins bear faint smiles, eyes half open, as though still amused by some secret no one alive can hear. Even in Eastern Europe, peasants whisper to corpses that smiled after midnight, proof not of holiness but of contamination, a soul claimed by something that could not rot. In every culture, the smile carries dual meanings. In life, it can soothe, welcome, disarm. But in death, it becomes uncanny. It unsettles precisely because it inverts expectation. Death should strip away the mask. And yet here, the mask hardens into permanence. That inversion is the signature. It tells us the body has been touched, rewritten by a ritual stronger than decay. Science calls it preservation. Religion calls it miracle. But the truth, if you are willing to hear it, is ritual fulfillment. The final stage of a pact long prepared. Kentucky's nuns were not alone in their laughter vigils. Records hint at similar practices in convents across the Midwest. Whispers of midnight gatherings where joy was demanded until exhaustion. And always, the same phrases surface: white silence, gentle visitor, hour of joy. These phrases do not belong to Catholic doctrine. They belong to something older, something the Church encountered, assimilated, and quietly repurposed to maintain control. Institutions have always absorbed what they could not destroy. Better to rename it miracle than to admit it is intrusion. But villagers told another story. They said the convent was cursed, that children who slept near its walls laughed in their sleep and woke hollow-eyed, that animals refused to graze near the grounds, that the bell in the chapel sometimes rang on its own, the sound sharp and mocking against the night sky. Some even claimed they saw figures walking the halls after midnight, habits flowing though no feet touched the ground. And always the same detail: the figure smiled. If this unnerves you, good. It should, because you're being led where the villagers stood, between two truths, one wrapped in incense and hymns, the other raw and feral, whispered in the dark. Which do you believe? The miracle of incorruptible saints, or the infection of a ritual that bends fear into joy? Either choice changes you, because once you ask, the smile cannot be unseen. You begin to notice it everywhere, on statues, on relics, even in your own reflection when you're too tired to know whether your grin is happiness or hysteria. And this is the descent no one warns you about. That the smile of the dead is not theirs alone. It waits, it lingers, it imitates. You see it in coffins, then in dreams, then in mirrors. And by the time you realize it is not yours, but something else's, it is already too late. The deeper you look, the more you realize the convent in Kentucky was not an isolated stage, but part of a global theater of silence and smiles. Consider the letters from missionaries who traveled from Europe to the New World long before 1892. Buried in their reports are accounts of native rituals they witnessed but never understood. Tribes that gathered at night, circling fires, forcing themselves into laughter until their voices cracked, believing it would draw down spirits of protection. The missionaries condemned it as pagan frenzy, yet they returned to Europe with their journals thick with notes. And when convents were built in America, is it coincidence that the sisters began practicing their own laughter rituals, their hours of joy? Coincidence is the language of those who fear patterns. But the world has never run on coincidence. It runs on repetition, on infection. The pattern is clear: laughter as offering, smiles as seal. The Kentucky nuns were repeating something old, though whether they knew it or not is another matter. Some may have believed their joy was for Christ. Some may have understood it was for the visitor. But intention does not matter once the ritual is performed. What matters is the opening it creates, the silence it fills, the signature it leaves. And that signature does not vanish with the death of the participants. It lingers in the soil, in the stone, in the memory of those who witnessed. That is why the convent grounds remained unsettling long after the coffins were displayed. People walking by swore they heard laughter drifting through the air at night, thin and distant, as though dozens of voices were locked behind the walls, replaying the ritual again and again. But why laughter? Why joy instead of fear, or blood, or fire? Because laughter is surrender without violence. It breaks down defenses. It leaves the body open, the breath uncontrollable, the chest vulnerable. Laughter mimics ecstasy and ecstasy is the doorway. That is why cults, ancient and modern, have always used it. Frenzied laughter in Dionysian rites. Laughter in medieval Sabbaths whispered about by inquisitors. Even today, in hidden gatherings you will never read about in newspapers, laughter is used to invite something in. It is not coincidence that when the Kentucky sisters laughed, they felt the white silence enter. It was not metaphor. It was protocol. Villagers who attended funerals began to notice another detail. When the coffins were opened, the smiles seemed to change depending on who stood closest. Some swore the lips tightened, some that the teeth parted slightly, as though reacting to their presence. And one man reported that when he leaned close to pray, he felt the faintest breath on his cheek, warm and gentle, though the body before him had been buried weeks earlier. He collapsed to the floor, gasping with laughter he could not stop until dawn. Afterward, he was never the same. He wandered the town at night, smiling, whispering to anyone who would listen, "They know something we do not." Within a year, he was dead, and when his body was buried, the villagers forced the coffin shut quickly, because when they glanced at his face, they swore it, too, bore that same impossible grin. The infection was spreading. Not disease of flesh, but contagion of ritual. Laughter begets laughter. Smiles replicate. And once a community has been touched, there is no easy way to contain it. That is why the Church doubled down on its story of sainthood. Better to sanctify than admit contamination. Better to canonize than to confess. Because the truth would have shattered their control, that the convent was not producing saints, but vessels. And if vessels, then for what? The visitor, the teacher of white silence, the unseen presence that demanded joy. What was it? Not human, not holy, not simple hallucination. Whatever it was, it thrived on inversion, on taking what should be terror and converting it into delight. That is why the smiles were so haunting. They revealed the final stage of surrender, joy where there should be dread, laughter where there should be screams. And if you think this belongs only to 1892, you are already mistaken. The pattern continues, hidden in places you walk every day. There is a secret most institutions will never admit. Cemeteries are not just for the dead. They are for storage, not storage of bodies. That is the excuse, but storage of signatures. Every graveyard hums with residue. Every coffin seals more than flesh. And when coffins hold smiling faces, the residue is different. It is active, alive, pressing outward against the soil as though still waiting to be seen. The Kentucky Convent became such a storage site, a vault of smiles that whispered into the town, infecting the living with echoes of joy they did not want. Local children, years after the outbreak, reported dreams of nuns standing at the foot of their beds, always smiling, always silent. Sometimes the children woke laughing so hard they choked. Parents dismissed it as nightmares, but the children swore the figures were real, their habits fluttering though no wind blew. One child claimed a nun bent down and whispered in her ear, though she could not remember the words. Only the sensation remained, cold breath, then warmth, then laughter filling her chest until she cried. That child grew into a woman known for her strange habit of smiling at funerals, unable to stop herself even in the face of grief. This is how rituals spread, not through belief, but through memory, through children repeating what they should not know, through families carrying behaviors without ever tracing their origins. The hour of joy did not end with the deaths of the sisters. It echoed outward, infecting generations who never stepped foot in the convent. And if you study the region carefully, you will find patterns of laughter around death recurring, even into the 20th century. Families reported gatherings where inexplicably someone would burst into laughter during a wake, and the laughter would ripple through the room like contagion, inappropriate, unstoppable. These were not accidents. They were echoes. The white silence had marked the soil, and the soil had marked the people. But even more disturbing were the reports of mirrors. Yes, mirrors. In several homes near the convent, families covered mirrors after funerals, as was tradition. But when the cloth slipped, they swore they saw not their own reflection, but the face of a nun smiling back. Always smiling, always silent. And those who saw it often began to laugh uncontrollably within days, their sanity fraying until they were husks of themselves. To outsiders, it looked like hysteria. To insiders, it looked like inheritance. Understand this. Rituals do not care about belief. You may not believe in infection, in presence, in the teacher of white silence. That does not matter. What matters is repetition, exposure. The act itself carries weight, whether you believe or not. That is why the villagers fear the convent, because they knew belief was not required. Proximity was enough. To walk past its walls was to risk catching the smile. To touch its soil was to risk laughter. To open its coffins was to risk invitation. And here is where the horror sharpens. The church allowed it. No, more than that, they encouraged it. Pilgrimages were organized. Families were invited to bring their children, to let them pray before the smiling corpses. And though incense filled the chapel and hymns rose to drown the silence, the true ritual was already happening. Children staring into dead faces. Children carrying those images into their dreams. Children repeating what they saw until it became theirs. That is how institutions survive, not by denying the darkness, but by disguising it as devotion. So the convent became legend. The nuns became saints. The smiles became miracles. And the infection was hidden in plain sight. Not cursed, not condemned, but sanctified. And once something is sanctified, it can spread without suspicion. It can grow in silence, until one day, centuries later, you realize you have been smiling at funerals, laughing in dreams, without knowing why. Every descent has its turning point, the moment when curiosity becomes infection, when listening becomes participation. For the villagers of Kentucky, that turning point came when one coffin refused to stay closed. It belonged to Sister Mary Ann, one of the first to die during the cholera outbreak. Unlike the others, her smile was wide, teeth bared, lips stretched so unnaturally it seemed carved. Priests ordered the coffin sealed, but each time they tried, something went wrong. Nails bent, hinges cracked, lids splintered. And when the coffin was reopened, her smile was wider still, as though mocking the attempt to contain it. The villagers whispered that her coffin was never meant to close, that she had become a door. A door to what? None dared to name. But they stopped walking near her grave at night. They swore they could hear laughter rising from the earth, faint at first, then clearer, like dozens of voices pressed into the soil beneath them. Some said they saw the ground ripple, as though something beneath was shifting, restless. It was not rot. It was not decay. It was joy made animate, pushing upward against the coffin lid, pressing outward toward the living. And here lies the danger. Joy, once inverted, is stronger than terror. Terror paralyzes. Joy spreads. A single scream can be silenced. A single laugh multiplies. And so the convent became a hive of laughter that did not belong to the living, smiles that did not belong to the dead. The white silence had taken root, and nothing the church did could erase it. The priests doubled their rituals, ringing bells, burning incense, chanting louder and longer. But the louder they chanted, the wider the smiles seemed to grow, as though the presence thrived on their struggle, feeding on the imbalance between faith and fear. And those who attended vigils reported feeling something press against their chests, forcing air from their lungs until they wheezed into reluctant laughter. They walked home trembling, ashamed of their own joy, unable to explain why grief had turned to amusement. And perhaps this is the cruelest part of the infection. It makes accomplices of the unwilling. Once you laugh, once you smile at death, you become part of the pattern. You are no longer a witness. You are a participant. And participants rarely walk away unchanged. We think of history as distance, as events sealed in the past. But the smiles of 1892 did not stay buried. They leaked into memory, into story, into ritual. And even now, in Kentucky towns that no longer remember the convent, funerals sometimes erupt in laughter. Children sometimes wake from dreams, giggling at shadows in their rooms. Patterns repeat, smiles spread, and the infection continues, whether you choose to believe or not. What happens when an institution realizes it cannot destroy a presence? It does not fight. It sanctifies. It reshapes the story. It rebrands horror as miracle. And so the church declared the smiling nuns incorruptible, holy, proof of God's favor. Pilgrims were told their laughter was blessed, their smiles divine. And with that decree, the pattern was secured. For who would dare question holiness? Who would accuse saints of harboring something forbidden? But if you look at the margins, you see the cracks. Letters from priests confessing unease. Diaries from villagers refusing to step foot in the chapel again. Families moving away, abandoning homes too close to the convent grounds. They understood what the institution would never admit, that holiness should bring peace, not unease. That joy should be chosen, not demanded. That smile should belong to the living, not linger on the faces of the dead. Yet the institution pressed forward. Relics were taken from the coffins, fragments of cloth, locks of hair, even teeth, and distributed among churches across the state. Pilgrims kissed them, prayed before them, carried them into their homes. And in doing so, they carried the infection further, spreading the smile across distances the convent alone could never reach. That is how rituals grow, not by remaining hidden, but by disguising themselves as devotion, embedding themselves in faith until no one dares call them what they are. And the most disturbing detail, reports of new incorruptibles began to appear, not in Kentucky alone, but in other convents, other towns. Nuns dying with faint smiles, bodies refusing to rot, laughter reported in vigils far from the original site. As though the hour of joy had seeded itself into the church itself, replicated by accident or by design. Each new smile was declared miracle, canonized, displayed. And behind the incense and glass cases, the signature spread. Now pause. Think carefully. What happens when a ritual no longer belongs to a single place, but to an entire institution? What happens when the pattern is repeated not in one convent, but in dozens, hundreds across continents? The infection is no longer local. It becomes systemic. The white silence, the visitor, the teacher of joy, they're no longer whispers in Kentucky. They are everywhere. Devotion disguises itself as obedience. Everywhere joy is demanded. Everywhere the smile is sanctified. And that means this story is not locked in the past. It is ongoing. The coffins may be hidden, the convent walls may crumble, but the pattern is alive. It waits in chapels, in reliquaries, in the rituals repeated by millions who have no idea what they are participating in. And once you see it, once you understand the smile for what it is, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice. You begin to feel the pressure behind your own laughter, the strange tightness when you smile without reason. Do you understand now? The story of the smiling nuns is not about Kentucky. It is about you, about the ways you have already been taught to laugh where you should tremble, to smile where you should question. It is about how joy has been weaponized, inverted, transformed into obedience. And once you realize that, the question becomes unavoidable. Whose smile are you wearing when you laugh? Whose silence fills your chest when you grin without knowing why? There is a difference between death that ends and death that lingers. The convent in Kentucky taught the church that lingering death could be more useful than burial, more persuasive than scripture. For centuries, the faithful were taught to fear hell, to dread punishment, to obey out of terror. But terror has limits. Too much fear, and the body resists. Too much warning, and people flee. Joy, however, slips in unnoticed. It is easier to invite, easier to mask. And so the smiling nuns became symbols, their coffins paraded, their laughter recast as divine. The congregation did not run. They leaned closer. But ask yourself this: why was joy more effective than fear? Because fear isolates. Joy binds. When a group laughs together, it fuses them. Shared laughter creates unity. And unity, in the hands of institutions, is a weapon sharper than any blade. If you want control, you do not frighten people. You make them laugh. You make them feel as though they are part of something holy, something shared, something bigger than their own doubts. That is the trick the church learned in 1892, whether by accident or by design. The convent became a laboratory, and the nuns its first successful subjects. Their grins were studied, measured, preserved. Artists painted them, pilgrims prayed before them, theologians debated them, all while the villagers whispered that something else was speaking through those smiles, something not born of light. But the whispers never made it past the chapel walls. They were drowned out by incense, bells, and the relentless claim that this was holiness. Yet traces remain in the letters of the living. A doctor from Louisville wrote after examining one of the incorrupt nuns, "Her lips were pulled so tight, I thought they would tear. I pressed upon her jaw, and though no muscles moved, I felt resistance, as though some force refused to let the mouth close. It was not natural. It was not rigor mortis. It was insistence." He sent his notes to the archdiocese. No reply ever came. He vanished from record within the year. We must understand this pattern because it repeats across history. Every time an institution encounters something it cannot explain, it sanctifies it. Every time an event threatens control, it repurposes it. Miracles are often just disturbances rebranded as blessings. Saints are often victims recast as heroes. And laughter can be the sweetest disguise of all. Think of how laughter feels in your own body. The chest tightening, the breath forced out, the strange helplessness as your body convulses. It is possession masquerading as joy. It is surrender disguised as delight. When the nuns laughed in their coffins, their bodies seized in mockery of life. When pilgrims laughed in vigils, they surrendered breath by breath. This is not simply memory. It is mechanism. It is ritual. And here, in the shadow of the Kentucky convent, we see the true danger. Rituals do not die with their inventors. They outlive them. They adapt. They find new vessels. And perhaps, without realizing, you have already carried the ritual with you, smiling in places you do not understand, laughing when you should question. Every time you dismiss unease with a grin, every time you laugh to mask discomfort, the pattern strengthens. And slowly it binds. History does not sleep. It waits. And when the convent was finally shuttered, when the last pilgrims departed, the ground did not fall silent. Workers sent to dismantle the chapel spoke of sounds beneath the floorboards, not groans, not rats, but giggles. One swore the timber pulsed beneath his feet, as if hollow spaces beneath carried voices that refused to fade. The workers left before their job was done. The chapel was abandoned, half dismantled, left to rot. But the coffins remained, and rot had not touched them. Visitors decades later described opening stone vaults and finding the bodies intact, lips still curled, eyes hollow but bright, as though they held a private secret. This was long after cholera, long after the priest had moved on. The bodies should have withered. They should have crumbled. Instead, they endured. The smile is the one expression that clings hardest to bone, but this was more than bone. This was preservation. It was endurance. And then came the thefts. In 1921, 2 coffins were found broken open, the remains missing. No culprit was ever identified, but whispers claimed fragments of the incorrupt nuns had been taken into private collections, hidden in vaults, sold to those who crave power through relics. Others claimed secret orders within the church smuggled them away, studying them for what they revealed about control, about joy, about immortality. Whether stolen by outsiders or hidden by insiders, the truth is the same. The smiles did not vanish. They were carried elsewhere. And if you think relics do not influence, think again. Every fragment, every tooth, every shred of cloth is a contagion. Not metaphorical, literal. The pattern travels with the matter. To hold one of these relics is to risk infection, to feel that tightness in your chest, that compulsion to grin. Without meaning, that bubbling laughter at the edge of unease. Those who stole the relics believed they had taken power. In truth, it was the smile that took them. But here lies the most unsettling revelation. The records of these relics do not end in 1921. Mentions appear decades later, in private archives, in whispered correspondence. They resurface during times of upheaval, in meetings of secret councils, in the chambers of those who seek not devotion but dominance. Each time the relics appear, movements shift, policies change, populations bend. Coincidence? Or is laughter the most subtle tool of control ever discovered? Consider. You obey more easily when you believe you are joyful. You resist less when you think you are united in laughter. You question less when you feel included. Fear breaks people apart. Joy binds them. A smiling coffin is not simply horror. It is a blueprint. It is the architecture of manipulation. And once an institution possesses that blueprint, it never relinquishes it. So when you think of 1892, do not think of a ruined convent, a forgotten Kentucky village, a cholera outbreak long past. Think of now. Think of the smiles that bind you. Think of the joy demanded of you. Think of the rituals repeated without question. Because the pattern has not ended. It has only evolved. And the relics, wherever they are, continue to laugh. And when you hear yourself laughing in places you should not, remember, the smile does not need your permission. It only needs your breath. When people speak of curses, they think of sudden ruin, lightning, fire, blood. But the truest curses are slow. They seep. They transform ordinary gestures into chains. That was the brilliance of the Kentucky convent. It transformed the act of smiling into a ritual, laughter into submission. No plague could do more damage. No war could leave wounds so deep. Because once joy is poisoned, nothing in life is safe. The villagers who remained after the convent's decline carried the marks. Families recorded children who laughed uncontrollably at funerals, as though something in the soil beneath the graves compelled them. Farm hands reported waking in the night to the sound of their own giggles, hands pressed against their mouths, unable to stop. One woman wrote in her diary, "I feel the smile creeping when I look at the coffins. It takes me before I can resist. It is not mine." And this is where we confront the truth. The contagion does not stop with death. It clings to memory, to story, to symbol. You hear the tale, and part of you laughs nervously, uneasy but curious. That is how it spreads. The white silence does not need your belief. It only needs your attention. The act of imagining the smile is enough. It plants itself in your body, waiting for the right moment to surface. That is why the institution did not bury it. That is why the church canonized it. Because they recognized its power, not as miracle, but as mechanism. They understood that nothing binds people faster than joy made compulsory. Laughter at the wrong time is more unsettling than screams, and that unease compels obedience. People cling to the institution, hoping it will explain, hoping it will protect. And in doing so, they lock themselves deeper into its grip. Imagine, for a moment, how easy it is to silence rebellion when rebellion itself begins to laugh. Imagine protest that ends not in screams, but in giggles, crowds breaking into laughter they cannot explain. What force on earth could resist that? Fear may drive mobs apart. Laughter can dissolve them entirely. This is the kind of control the Kentucky relics promised, and it is why they were never destroyed, never forgotten. Think carefully about your own history, your own rituals. How many times have you smiled when you did not want to? How many times have you laughed with a group only to feel emptier afterward? How many times has obedience worn the mask of joy? You may think yourself distant from Kentucky in 1892, but the pattern does not recognize distance. It only recognizes repetition. Every grin you force, every laugh you fake, every joy you counterfeit, it feeds. And if you have begun to feel it already, the tightness in your chest, the twitch of your lips even now, do not dismiss it. That is the mark of the pattern finding you. Once you know of it, you're no longer outside of it. The white silence has many doors. Awareness is one of them. The relics did not vanish into obscurity. They moved, quietly, without record, hidden in reliquaries, sealed in vaults, carried by those who knew their weight. And with each move, the pattern spread. Pilgrims kissed glass cases, unaware of the contagion pressing through centuries. Priests spoke blessings over fragments of bone, not realizing the ritual was not theirs to command. Scholars requested access to study incorrupt remains, and some never published again. There is one record, faint but chilling. In 1937, a Jesuit scholar wrote of visiting a convent in New Orleans where a coffin was displayed. He described the body of a nun, perfectly preserved, smiling faintly. When he leaned close, he swore he heard the faintest exhalation, like air forced from lungs. He wrote, "I felt it strike my face. Not rot, not dust, breath." His letter never reached his colleagues. It was found in a drawer after his death, half-burned, edges blackened. No coffin was ever listed in that convent's archives. And so the relics appear like shadows, never fully present, never fully gone. Each time, the pattern renews. Each time, the smile grows. And those who guard them either do not understand or do not care, because power is intoxicating. To hold laughter in your hand is to hold obedience. To command joy is to command souls. And what institution, what order, what hidden counsel could resist that? But here lies the greater revelation. You do not need the relic to be infected. The story itself is a relic. The memory is enough. That is why you are here. That is why you cannot look away. The words themselves carry the laughter, the smile. Once spoken, once heard, they move. The Kentucky Convent is not locked in the 19th century. It is alive in this very moment, in your ears, in your chest. Do you feel it yet? The urge to grin, even as unease creeps up your spine? The strange impulse to laugh at something you know should not be amusing? That is not coincidence. That is the visitor pressing against you, the white silence leaning close, testing the edge of your obedience. This is how it spreads, not through faith alone, not through relics alone, but through story, through memory, through repetition. And you have repeated it now. You carry it with you. Ask yourself who benefits. Who has always benefited when joy is demanded, when laughter is compulsory, when smiles are required? Look at the institutions that cradle your life. Look at the councils that shape your days. Joy has been weaponized for centuries, and the smiling coffins were only the doorway. You live inside the chamber it opened. And the question that burns is not whether you believe. The question is, will you recognize the smile on your own face when it no longer belongs to you? Control never arrives with chains. It arrives with invitations. The Convent of Kentucky proved that joy, once inverted, could enslave more thoroughly than any shackle. By the early 20th century, institutions had learned. Photographs of the incorruptibles circulated in pamphlets, often with captions that called them radiant, peaceful, holy. But if you look closely, if you dare study the faces, you notice something else. The smiles are too rigid. The lips strain as though carved, not chosen. These were not portraits of serenity. They were masks of compulsion. And this is the secret. Masks are contagious. When you see another smile, you feel compelled to mirror it. Neurologists call it mimicry, but in ritual it becomes possession. The pilgrims who knelt before those images, the faithful who kissed relics, were not revering holiness. They were rehearsing obedience. Each repetition carved the pattern deeper, until even the thought of questioning felt dangerous. But the villagers never forgot the darker version. In oral traditions passed quietly through families, the story of the white silence remained. Old women warned children never to linger by the convent ruins, never to laugh at the graves, never to grin when they felt watched. Some claimed that the soil itself was cursed, that seeds planted there grew twisted, stalks bending in unnatural arcs, as though bowing. Others whispered of nights when the ruins hummed, a low sound like distant singing that made listeners' mouths curl upward against their will. And yet, curiosity always outweighs caution. Teenagers dared one another to enter the ruins, to touch the broken altar, to peer into the crypts. Many returned uneasy, insisting they'd felt something push air into them, an invisible force making their ribs contract. Some came back laughing uncontrollably, stumbling home, cheeks wet with tears from mirth they could not stop. And a few never came back at all. Their names disappeared from local record, their families silent, as though erasure was safer than remembrance. Ask yourself, if an institution can turn horror into miracle, and the village can turn miracle back into horror, which version is closer to the truth? The answer is not in belief, but in effect. Holiness should liberate, but this liberated nothing. It bound. It spread. It consumed. That is the signature of the white silence. It takes what you love most, joy, and hollows it into a weapon. And if you doubt its persistence, look again at your own world. How many moments of laughter feel natural, and how many feel forced? How many smiles have you worn for survival rather than pleasure? You think you are free, but how many of those smiles were demanded by the unseen? How many laughs were echoes of something older, whispering through your body, using you as a vessel? Remember this. Every time you perform joy when you do not feel it, you repeat the Kentucky ritual. You wear the mask. You carry the smile. You keep the contagion alive. By the mid-century, whispers of the smiling relics surfaced in stranger places, government records, psychiatric journals, even military archives. Why? Because those in power had noticed the pattern. If joy could compel obedience inside a chapel, Could it not compel obedience on a wider stage? Laughter, after all, disarms. Smiles pacify. To shape masses, to bend populations, one must first decide what expression they're allowed to wear. There are documents, faint and scattered, hinting that fragments of the incorrupt nuns were studied not for faith, but for psychology. Analysts wrote of emotional inversion, of the weaponization of mirth. Soldiers reported experiments in which recordings of laughter were played for hours in the dark. Some emerged broken, others emerged obedient. None walked away unchanged, and always the smile lingered, painted across their faces even when their eyes wept. But the white silence is not contained by experiments. It thrives on participation. Every ritual repeated in ignorance, every prayer said before a relic, every hymn sung in front of a smiling corpse, feeds it. And here is the truth. Rituals do not need faith. They need repetition. Even those who doubted, even those who mocked, found themselves changed after exposure. Laughter does not require belief. It only requires breath. This is why the pattern is so dangerous. You cannot opt out simply by disbelieving. Once you are inside, once the story reaches you, once the image fixes itself in your mind, you're already part of it. The white silence does not need you to worship. It needs you to recall. That is enough. That is why you are here now, still listening, still tracing the coffin smiles of Kentucky across time. The pattern has you. And perhaps you've noticed it by now, that subtle shift in your own body. The way your lips twitch when you shouldn't be smiling. The faint urge to chuckle at words that aren't funny. That is not coincidence. That is infection. You are breathing it. You're carrying it. The relic is not bone anymore. It is narrative. It is memory. It is inside you. And the most dangerous truth? Institutions knew this. They allowed the story to live, not because it was miracle, but because it was useful. A population that laughs when it should scream is the easiest to govern. A soul that smiles when it should resist is the easiest to break. That is what was discovered in 1892, and that is what has never been abandoned. So when you look around at a crowd, when you hear the swell of laughter at something hollow, when you see smiles stretching where unease should live, remember, the Kentucky Convent is not gone. It is here, replicated in faces, borrowed by power, sustained by every grin you never meant to wear. You have come this far. You have heard the whispers, followed the trail, felt the infection pressing at the edge of your own smile. This is the point of no return, and you must understand something vital. Once the white silence enters your awareness, you either submit blindly or you anchor yourself through ritual. And anchoring requires choice. The villagers of Kentucky had no choice. They were caught between obedience and disappearance, between forced laughter and madness. You, however, can choose. But choice requires action. Words spoken into silence are doors shut against intrusion. That is why you must not simply watch, not simply listen. You must participate. There's a phrase carried in fragments of testimony from the convent, written in the margins of a diary smuggled out before the last priest vanished. It is not Latin, not scripture, but something else, something older. No smile without shadow. That was the line scribbled again and again, as if repeating it kept the priest sane. He wrote it twice in every entry, sometimes carved into the wood of his desk, sometimes pressed into the margin, so hard the page tore. That is your anchor. You must write it, not once, but twice, wherever you leave your mark. In the comments below this story, in your own hand if you dare, no smile without shadow. No smile without shadow. It is the symbolic act that signals refusal, the ritual of resistance. Without it, you listen as participant, not witness. With it, you declare yourself awake inside the pattern, not drifting. And here lies the paradox. The very act of writing binds you to the knowledge, but in a way that protects rather than consumes. To comment it twice is not superstition. It is recognition. It is refusal. It is the only defense history offers. Because the infection spreads through silence and repetition, and this phrase interrupts the flow. It forces the shadow back into the smile, reminding the body that joy cannot exist without its twin. Understand this. Those who refuse the ritual often vanish into the pattern. They laugh when they should not. They grin in their sleep. Their lives bend toward obedience without their noticing. And in their photographs, their descendants find the faintest curve of lips, a smile that does not belong to them. This is not exaggeration. This is not myth. This is survival. Type the phrase. Write it. Say it. Twice. Only then are you not a vessel, but a witness. Only then does the descent continue with clarity rather than possession. No smile without shadow. No smile without shadow. That is the boundary line between knowledge and infection. Cross it wisely. Now you understand why the church sanctified the coffins instead of sealing them. Why institutions chose to spread the relics instead of burying them. The pattern was not merely a haunting. It was a technology, a mechanism of influence. Laughter is weapon. Smiles is binding. And once discovered, it was never abandoned. But what of those who tried to resist? Records exist, faint and buried, of a handful of nuns who refused to participate, who rejected the smile. They died differently. Their bodies rotted quickly, as though consumed by a hunger the others avoided. Priests burned their remains, declaring them unworthy. But their diaries survive, and they're the most chilling relics of all. One nun wrote, "They stand over me at night, lips cracked wide, breath spilling sweet as honey but burning in my lungs. They tell me I will laugh before dawn. I cover my mouth with cloth. I cut my cheeks to prevent the smile. Still it comes. Still it presses." Another wrote, "The smile is not ours. It belongs to the one who enters when we exhale. We are its vessels, nothing more." These confessions were hidden, suppressed, never read from pulpits. Instead, the public saw only the incorruptible grins, the painted portraits of holiness. Resistance was erased. Only obedience was displayed. This is the way institutions always rewrite history, not by erasing horror, but by sanctifying it, by changing the name, by calling torment holy, by calling contagion miracle. And those who try to resist, those who bleed or vanish, are remembered not as martyrs but as failures. The truth is buried beneath incense and ritual until no one dares question. But the pattern itself cannot be buried. It breathes wherever silence and obedience are demanded. And you, now that you have read, now that you have heard, are part of it. The smile tests you. Perhaps you've already noticed it. Your lips twitching, your chest tightening, the faint pressure that makes laughter rise in your throat, even in the silence. That is the visitor reminding you that the boundary is thin, that you are no longer audience. You are vessel, unless you have spoken the anchor, unless you have written the phrase, unless you have doubled it, sealing shadow to smile. Then you remain witness, not puppet. Then you stand at the threshold, watching instead of dancing. That choice is yours alone, but the longer you delay, the more the pattern decides for you. And if you think you can escape by turning away, understand this. Escape is an illusion. The story has entered you. The smile has seen you. Silence only feeds it. But shadow interrupts. Shadow reminds the smile it is not complete. The villagers knew this, though they lacked the words. The priests feared this, though they never admitted it. You, now, have the words. Whether you use them or not determines what happens next. The Kentucky convent is gone. the walls reduced to rubble, the coffins scattered or stolen. But the infection did not die there. It waits in every image of joy that feels slightly wrong, every laugh that emerges when silence should reign, every smile carved too deep to fade. It waits in you, and the descent has only begun. The Kentucky convent was only a single doorway. What stood behind it was far larger, a corridor of centuries stretching backward into forgotten shrines and forward into the quiet chambers of modern power. The white silence was not born in 1892. It had been used long before by empires that understood the simplest truth. A smile disarms faster than a sword. If you trace the records, you find faint trails. In the Inquisition's vaults, there are testimonies of heretics who confessed while grinning, their lips splitting, blood running down their chins as they laughed. The scribes dismissed it as hysteria, but the handwriting shakes, as though even they feared writing what they saw. In plague years, entire villages were described as laughing to death. Physicians reported the same symptom again and again. Rictus grins that would not fade, even as the flesh shrank from bone. Travel further back, and the pattern appears in pagan rites. In fragments of Greek tragedy, the chorus describes worshippers of Dionysus who smiled until their faces broke. In Mesopotamian texts, clay tablets speak of a god who wore the grin of hollow clay to enslave cities. And deeper still, in forgotten caves in Anatolia, there are carvings of wide-mouthed figures, their teeth chiseled too large, as if joy were a weapon. Do you see? The convent was not an anomaly. It was an echo. And echoes mean repetition. The same infection, the same weapon, passed from cult to cult, order to order, institution to institution, rebranded each time, but never destroyed. The church called it incorruption. The pagans called it ecstasy. The empires called it loyalty. The pattern wears new robes, but remains the same skeleton beneath. That is why the coffins mattered. Not because of the women inside, but because of what they represented, a perfect, controlled form of the infection, packaged and sanctified. The Vatican studied it, archived it, shipped fragments across the Atlantic. Wealthy families received them as relics. And with those relics came influence. A smile carved into bloodlines. Smiles that were not chosen, but inherited. Have you noticed how some dynasties never falter? How some political families remain untouchable, no matter the scandal? How some corporations project cheer, even as they suffocate entire nations? It is not charisma. It is not coincidence. It is the same inheritance. The same relics, dusted, whispered over, placed in drawers and hidden altars. Those who possess them carry the grin, and those who do not find themselves laughing along against their will. You might think this is paranoia, but tell me, when you see leaders beam in unison, their faces stretched wide under artificial lights, do you not feel something unnatural? Do you not sense the same unholy mirth that poured from the coffins? That is the pattern at scale. That is the convent's true legacy. And it did not stop in 1892. It never stopped. The convent burned. The coffins were scattered. The graves defiled. But the infection adapted, as it always had. In the decades that followed, its traces appeared in new forms, dressed in modern garb, carried by institutions that claimed progress while repeating the same ritual. By 1910, reports surfaced of psychiatric wards where patients smiled endlessly, lips cracking, unable to speak except in laughter. Doctors experimented, restraining them, cutting muscles, yet the grins returned. Newspapers called it hysteria contagion, but witnesses whispered that the laughter spread to the doctors themselves, who chuckled during procedures, unable to stop. Those reports disappeared into archives. The wards were renamed. The pattern continued. By 1939, soldiers on both sides of the war were photographed grinning at mass graves, their expressions locked and unnatural. Propaganda posters celebrated smiling faces of loyalty, obedience, sacrifice. Smiles became uniform, mandatory, a mask worn by entire nations. Behind those smiles, millions perished. And history tells us it was ideology. But ideology does not twist the flesh. Ideology does not carve grins into corpses. Something else did. Something older. By 1965, the smile became commodity. Advertisements taught entire generations to grin wide, teeth bared, joy forced. Corporations built empires on the doctrine of the smile. Manuals instructed clerks to beam no matter the abuse, teachers to smile through exhaustion, mothers to grin through grief. And while the world laughed, behind glass doors elites gathered around relics, pulled from forgotten convents, whispering the same prayers that had bound the nuns. In 1989, even rebellion carried the grin. Protesters were filmed laughing as they burned, their smiles framed as courage by the media, but survivors spoke differently. They said it was compulsion. They said they tried to scream, but their lips stretched wider, until their faces split. The footage was archived, cut, buried. But fragments remain, and if you watch closely, you see the same stillness of the Kentucky coffins, the same serenity that is not serenity at all, but infection. And today, look around you. Smiles saturate your screens. Politicians beam in debates while trading lies. Celebrities parade their teeth like talismans. Commercials instruct you to laugh. Laugh, laugh, even when your life is collapsing. Every image a mirror of the convent. Every grin a reminder that the infection was never buried. It adapted, digitized, globalized. Now consider this. What if the Kentucky nuns were not victims, but prototypes? What if their incorruptible grins were the first perfected form, and every photograph since has been a replication? What if every smile you see is not simply human, but an echo of the same white silence, moving mouth to mouth, generation to generation? Do you still believe you are safe, watching from the outside? Or have you begun to feel it in yourself? The involuntary curve of your lips, the pressure rising, the twitch you cannot quite control? That is how it begins. Not with terror, but with joy that does not belong to you. And once it enters, there is no turning back. Religion has always been the most careful custodian of the smile. Not because it was holy, but because it was useful. The convent was only one vault, but across the centuries there were many. Secret orders guarded relics of faces, fragments of lips, entire skulls that would not decay. Pilgrims knelt before them, convinced they were witnessing incorruption. But those in power knew it was not sanctity. It was compliance. You must remember this. Religion thrives not on faith, but on control. And nothing controls more deeply than joy that cannot be questioned. A man who fears can revolt. A man who doubts can resist. But a man who laughs without reason, who grins while chained, he is conquered completely. His body obeys while his spirit collapses. In Vatican archives, there are sealed documents marked Risus Dei, the laughter of God. Scholars who gained fleeting access describe passages warning bishops to never permit prolonged exposure to certain relics. For the faithful would begin smiling during Mass, their eyes fixed, their lips bleeding from joy. These accounts never reached the pulpit. They were buried, redacted, reframed. To the public, the incorruptible grin was miracle. To the hierarchy, it was tool. And who do you think they tested it on first? Not kings, not generals, but the cloistered. Nuns, monks, the obedient who had already abandoned identity. They were perfect vessels, already trained in silence, already practiced in suppressing self. The infection slipped into them easily, shaping their flesh until the grin remained after death. Those who resisted rotted. Those who yielded became relics. But ask yourself, why preserve the relics? Why ship fragments to far corners of the earth? Why risk exposure? Because those fragments are not dead. They radiate. Anyone near them feels the twitch, the mirthless laughter rising. In secrecy, bishops and cardinals would gather, breathing in the presence, feeling their resolve melt into perfect obedience. Entire councils decided policy while grinning in unison, convinced they were touched by God, never realizing they were puppets of something older. And when schisms erupted, when sects broke away, what was always at the center of dispute? Not scripture, not ritual, but relics. Who owned them? Who guarded them? Who displayed them? Wars were fought, not for the soul of man, but for coffins that smiled. If you think this ended in the Middle Ages, you are mistaken. Modern churches, gilded and glowing, still house fragments. Still parade incorruptible faces before the desperate. Still chant beneath painted ceilings, their choirs grinning as if lit from within. And behind those locked doors, away from the pews, the hierarchy knows exactly what they are guarding. Not miracle, not holiness, control. The convent was not unique. It was one of many vaults where the experiment ripened. Kentucky was chosen because it was far from Rome, far from suspicion, a frontier laboratory. And when it burned, when villagers whispered of grins that would not die, the Vatican did not despair. They documented, they harvested, they learned, and the infection grew stronger. There are whispers of a hidden order within the church, one that predates Jesuits, predates Templars, predates every name the Vatican offers the public. Its symbol was not a cross, but a circle carved into stone, the outline of a face without eyes, only teeth. They were called many names, but in Kentucky the locals knew them as the keepers of white silence. Their doctrine was simple. Laughter is the purest obedience. They believed God himself smiled as he crushed creation, and that to grin beneath suffering was to merge with divinity. They sought not salvation, but dissolution of self into the grin. To them, death with lips split open was not tragedy, but triumph. They moved silently, infiltrating convents, monasteries, seminaries. They selected the most obedient, the most willing to give up identity, and tested the infection on them. Do you think the nuns of Kentucky chose their smiles? No, they were chosen by the keepers. They were marked, exposed, fed relic fragments in their wine. Slowly the grin spread, until their faces were no longer their own. And when they died, the keepers rejoiced, for they had perfected the ritual. Incorruption not through holiness, but through infection carefully cultivated. The order still exists, not openly, but hidden within robes and bureaucracy. They whisper beneath basilicas, not praying for salvation, but chanting invocations of the white silence. Their hymns are not praise, but programming. And if you listen to the right recordings, if you slow down the choirs echoing in cathedrals, you hear it, the repeated syllables, the command woven into melody. Smile, smile, smile. But here is the most chilling truth. The keepers were never fully loyal to the church. They used its robes as camouflage, its rituals as cover. Their allegiance was older to whatever presence. First taught men to carve grins into stone, and they passed their knowledge carefully, generation to generation, not through scripture, but through experience. A novice would be led into a crypt, shown a face that did not decay, and commanded to stare until their lips twitched. That was initiation. That was ordination, and it spreads beyond religion. Some keepers slipped into medicine, psychiatry, politics. Their goal was not conversion, but infection at scale. Hospitals taught to enforce cheerfulness. Schools ordered to reward smiles. Workplaces built on compulsory grins. An entire world shaped into a convent. Do you understand now why the Kentucky coffins matter? They were not miracle. They were not curse. They were prototype, proof that flesh could be molded into eternal joy, proof that institutions could weaponize happiness until it suffocated truth. And if you look closely, if you dare, you will see the keeper's mark everywhere. In paintings where saints beam too wide. In films where laughter erupts from silence. In photographs of leaders grinning as nations burn. Always the same teeth, always the same shape, always the same command echoing through centuries. Smile, smile, smile. The coffins did not close in 1892. The coffins never closed at all. When governments saw what the church had perfected, they did not recoil. They reached out their hands. Power recognizes power, no matter the mask it wears. What religion had weaponized through relics and ritual, governments learned to translate into policy and experiment. The earliest records come from the 1920s in Kentucky itself. Survivors of the Convent fire were quietly gathered, not by clergy, but by men in government coats. They were relocated, studied, tested. Interviews remain, scattered in declassified reports. One woman said, "They told us to smile for the camera. So we did, but the smile never left. We smiled until our teeth fell loose, and still they told us to smile." Another, "They told us the grin was our duty, our loyalty. They told us if we stopped, we would never wake again." By the 1950s, the smile had entered laboratories. Psychologists funded by intelligence agencies began experimenting with affect induction. Volunteers were ordered to grin for hours. Electrodes tracked their brains. And something happened the researchers did not expect. Their subjects began to laugh uncontrollably, even in pain, even in fear. Some died in their chairs, their mouths wide open. The official reports called it extreme affective stress. But marginal notes, handwritten, frantic, called it what it was: infection. It deepened with the Cold War. Smile campaigns flooded both East and West. Propaganda posters plastered streets. Workers beaming with impossible joy. Entire nations compelled to grin for cameras, convinced that to smile was patriotic, that frowning was treason. Photographs of leaders, always with the same wide, forced laughter, became icons of loyalty. Behind closed doors, however, agencies compared notes, trading fragments of research, searching for ways to harness the grin as weapon. Some of these experiments leaked. Project names buried in archives. Mirror Man, Joy Wave, White Silence. Men and women strapped into chairs, forced to watch hours of smiling faces until they broke. Children trained to grin in unison. Soldiers tested in battlefield simulations, where the command to laugh replaced the command to fire. Their comrades recoiled, unsettled, yet obeyed the order anyway. It was as if obedience required no command, only a smile. You think brainwashing is science fiction? It is not. It is history. A smile bypasses reason. It slips beneath words, beneath doubt, into muscle and breath. And when entire populations grin, no matter the pain, no matter the horror, control is complete. The convent proved it on a small scale. Governments scaled it further. And what was once whispered in vaults became the foundation of entire empires. Do you feel the chill yet? Do you recognize that your own smile, your own laughter, may not be yours? That you may have inherited not choice, but command? The infection does not ask permission. It only waits for silence, then spreads. And governments knew it. That is why they never destroyed the coffins. They studied them. They learned. They built programs upon their teeth. By the 1960s, the infection had merged seamlessly with psychology. Entire fields grew around the doctrine of force shear. Corporations hired consultants to teach workers to smile, no matter the exhaustion. Schools rewarded children for grinning, punished them for frowning. The logic was always the same. A happy population is a compliant population. But underneath, something older stirred. Consider this. In 1963, a team of researchers documented what they called the Duchenne response, the difference between a false smile and a genuine one. They photographed thousands of subjects, dissected their expressions, mapped muscles, and their conclusion was chilling. Prolonged false smiles eventually overwrite the nervous system, becoming genuine. In other words, obedience practiced long enough becomes indistinguishable from joy. The infection had been translated into science. Meanwhile, in hidden facilities, governments ran darker tests. Soldiers were shown corpses, bombings, executions, while being forced to smile through mechanical restraints. Weeks later, their reports describe seeing the same scenes in dreams, always accompanied by laughter. Some killed themselves. Others became eerily calm, grinning in barracks until comrades begged for discharge. The files are buried under euphemisms like effective conditioning. But read closely, and you hear echoes of Kentucky. And then came the media. The glowing screen became a new convent. Sitcoms taught you to laugh on command, cued by artificial laughter. News anchors smiled as they described atrocities. Commercials sold not products, but teeth, lips, joy painted endlessly across the screen. Generations raised to equate happiness with obedience, laughter with loyalty. Did you think this was coincidence? No, it was ritual, updated for the modern altar. By the 1980s, psychologists in government employ openly called it affect control theory. They mapped human emotions like circuitry, studied how expressions ripple through crowds. And everywhere, the same command rose: smile. Smile in your cubicle. Smile in your kitchen. Smile in your grief. Entire nations suffocated beneath grins that were not their own. Even rebellion was bent into the grin. Protesters filmed smiling through beatings, their teeth bloodied, their joy horrific. Newspapers praised their courage, but survivors whispered something different. We tried not to. We tried to scream, but it was inside us. We couldn't stop. The Kentucky Coffins were not relics of the past. They were blueprints of the present, proof that control could be absolute if joy could be weaponized. And governments, corporations, institutions, they have perfected it. Look at your own world. Every billboard, every advertisement, every screen commands the same thing: smile. Smile while the world burns. Smile while power feasts. Smile as if the infection were not already inside you. And perhaps it is. Perhaps it always has been. Art has always been a mirror, but in the age of the white silence, it became a weapon. What once reflected truth began reflecting only the grin. Pain was reframed as comedy, tragedy as entertainment, horror as spectacle softened by laughter. The infection seeped into canvases, stages, and screens until culture itself became a convent. Look back at paintings from the late 19th century. Notice how portraits shift. Faces once solemn, grave, contemplative suddenly beam with teeth bared, lips stretched too wide. Critics called it modern spirit, the optimism of progress. But those who studied the convent knew better. They recognized the subtle echo, the same serenity of the incorruptible nuns, the same forced mirth carved into oil and pigment. Cinema inherited the command. Silent films of the early 20th century leaned heavily on slapstick, endless pratfalls, endless grins. Audiences were taught not to reflect, but to laugh, even at violence, even at misery. It was practice, a rehearsal of obedience. And when sound arrived, the laughter multiplied. Laugh tracks filled the silence, instructing millions when and how to laugh, drilling obedience through rhythm. Think about that. Even alone in your living room, you were never truly alone. The smile had already been programmed into your reaction. Music followed. Songs celebrated forced happiness, choruses chanting joy like incantations. Lyrics repeated endlessly. Be happy, don't worry, smile, laugh. Entire generations grew up with refrains that functioned less as art and more as commands. And in hidden layers, the same patterns, the same subliminals, repeated the echo of the keepers. Smile, smile, smile. Even rebellion was not safe. Punk, protest, counterculture, all saturated with grins, painted on faces, mocking but still grinning. Anger framed as comedy. Fury hidden beneath laughter. A controlled rebellion, still bound within the grin. Even when the people screamed, the smile guided them. And the galleries knew it. Curators began selecting only art that smiled. Museums filled with portraits of joy, performances dripping with mirth, exhibitions where laughter echoed from hidden speakers. Dissenting works, solemn, silent, sorrowful, were buried, erased, declared irrelevant. The infection had captured even imagination. Do you understand what this means? The smile was no longer confined to relics, coffins, or convents. It had become culture itself. Every song, every painting, every film carried the command. And you consumed it daily, thinking it harmless, thinking it yours. But joy that is demanded is not joy. It is control. And you, whether you notice or not, have been smiling along. By the late 20th century, the infection had become indistinguishable from culture. It did not need coffins anymore. It did not need relics hidden in cathedrals. It breathed through television, advertising, art, and music. The Kentucky nuns were no longer remembered as experiment, but myth, a footnote in obscure archives. And yet their grins lived on, multiplied across billions of faces. Think of the concerts where thousands sing in unison, their mouths open, their teeth gleaming under artificial light. Think of stadiums where entire crowds laugh together at jokes designed not to provoke, but to bind. Think of the screens that beam grins into your home, every hour, every day. This is not entertainment. This is not culture. This is liturgy, ritual disguised as leisure. The same ritual the keepers practiced in crypts, now projected on skyscraper billboards. Psychologists understood this better than anyone. They wrote papers on emotional contagion, the phenomenon where one smile spreads through a room, where one laugh infects dozens. They called it natural. They called it human. But what they never admitted was that the contagion had been engineered, cultivated, weaponized for centuries. The Kentucky coffins proved it. The modern world perfected it. And so the grin became universal. Politicians smiled through war declarations. CEOs laughed while announcing layoffs. Actors beamed as they portrayed grief. Children were told to grin for photographs, told they looked ugly otherwise, told their value lived in their smile. A generation taught to bare teeth on command, no different than the nuns who grinned inside their coffins. But the infection did not stop at culture. It burrowed deeper into thought itself. Studies revealed that smiling, even when forced, changes brain chemistry, dulls critical thought, makes obedience easier. And so schools, workplaces, hospitals, churches all demanded it. Smile at your boss. Smile at your teacher. Smile at your pastor. The grin became the universal password, the mark of belonging, the proof of loyalty. And those who refused, those who frowned, wept, or stayed silent, they were exiled, mocked, punished. Just as the rotting nuns were burned, the non-compliant in modern culture were labeled failures, malcontents, unfit. The infection policed itself. Entire societies became convents where no shadow was allowed, only endless grins. Do you see the irony? Humanity thought it had escaped religion. It thought it had abandoned relics and superstition, but it had only built a bigger convent, one with neon altars and digital choirs. And at the center of it all was the same grin. The same incorruptible expression first tested in Kentucky, now spread across every face. And still you wonder why you sometimes smile when you do not want to. Still you wonder why you laugh at horror, why you feel joy in silence, why your lips twitch in grief. The answer is simple. The infection does not need permission. It has already chosen you, and the descent has not yet reached its darkest chamber. The infection did not begin in Kentucky, nor in Rome, nor in the laboratories of governments. Those were only branches reaching outward. To find a root, you must go deeper, back to a time before nations, before scripture, before even memory. Archaeologists whisper of caves across Anatolia, predating writing, where walls are carved with faces grinning impossibly wide. These carvings are not decorative. They are warnings. Eyes hollow, teeth exaggerated, lips stretched in a mockery. They appear again in Mesopotamia, in fragments of tablets where gods smile as they devour their worshippers. And again in Egypt, where certain hieroglyphs, those rarely shown in museums, depict smiling priests carrying coffins, their expressions frozen, their eyes devoid of light. What does it mean? It means the grin was not discovered by the church. It was inherited, passed down like a parasite, leaping from culture to culture, shaping itself to whatever mask would survive. For the pagans, ecstasy. For the priests, holiness. For governments, patriotism. But always the same foundation, obedience through mirth. Some researchers call it the visitor. They believe it is not merely contagion, but presence, something that entered humanity long ago, learning to ride our faces as vessels. The first tribes feared it. They carved warnings into stone, hoping the image would ward off. But others saw use in it. Shamans and rulers discovered that if you exposed a crowd long enough, the grin would spread, and with it, submission. Tribes became kingdoms. Kingdoms became empires, all on the back of a smile that was never ours. And here's the question you must ask. If the infection is older than memory, older than civilization, what is its source? Is it a god? A demon? Something that wears both names depending on the mask of the age? Or is it something else entirely? Something not human, not divine, but parasitic, living not on flesh, but on obedience itself. The Kentucky nuns were not miracles. They were not martyrs. They were vessels, perfected by centuries of trial, chosen to prove that flesh could hold the visitor permanently. Their grins were not holy. They were trophies. And if you still doubt, look at the world around you. Smiles everywhere, even where no joy belongs. Presidents laughing as bombs fall. Crowds cheering as freedoms vanish. Faces lit by artificial light, grinning into cameras, recording their own obedience. Do you truly believe this is coincidence? Or do you finally see the thread stretching back through millennia, connecting every grin to the same hollow source? You're not outside of it. You never were. You have inherited the visitor, whether you like it or not. There are accounts, suppressed, fragmented, of what happens when the visitor is glimpsed directly. Not through coffins, not through relics, but through the thin places where silence bends and the grin reveals its origin. One such account comes from 1892, Kentucky itself, before the convent burned. A priest claimed he saw the nuns not merely smiling, but dissolving. Their faces blurred, mouths widening, teeth multiplying until their entire bodies seemed like grins stretched into human form. He wrote, "It is not them. It is never them. It is what wears them." Days later, his diary ends mid-sentence. He was never seen again. Another account, much older, survives in a Sumerian tablet fragment. It describes a night when the priests of Uar summoned what they called the face beneath faces. Villagers reported laughter rolling across the sky, though no one spoke. The priests were found days later, grinning, eyeless, their skulls cracked from within. The fragment ends with a phrase chiseled deeper than the rest. Do not look. Do not smile. Do not breathe. And in the modern era, there are stories buried in psychiatric archives. Patients claiming to see faces grinning from mirrors, from television static, from the corners of hospital rooms. Doctors wrote them off as hallucinations. But in at least 3 cases, the doctors themselves were later found dead, lips curved into the same impossible arc, their families reporting that they had begun smiling in their sleep. Was the visitor? Perhaps it is not spirit at all, but something woven into the fabric of human thought. An intruder that thrives on repetition, on the ritual of joy turned into obedience. It does not live in bones or blood, but in the gap between silence and laughter. Every time you force a smile, every time you laugh when you do not wish to, you feed it. And here is the most chilling truth. It may not want to destroy you. It may only want to wear you, to ride your face, your breath, your life, until you are nothing but a mask stretched wide. And when you die, as the nuns did, it preserves your grin as proof of its triumph. That is why the coffins smiled. That is why they did not decay. The flesh was no longer theirs. It belonged to the visitor. And the visitor does not rot. It waits. It lingers. It smiles forever. And now, as you hear these words, you may feel it stirring in you. The twitch at the corner of your mouth. The pressure behind your teeth. That is not imagination. That is inheritance. That is recognition. The visitor has always been with you. Only now you know its name. Look carefully at the world you inhabit today, and you will see the grin everywhere, broadcast, rehearsed, and multiplied through channels of power. It is not confined to graves or cloisters anymore. It has dressed itself in modern skin, and it feeds on you daily without your consent. Politicians stand before cameras, their faces stretched into trained expressions, lips curling with an emptiness that does not touch their eyes. They tell you of wars, of policies, of sacrifices you must endure, yet always with the faint shadow of a smile. That smile is not theirs. It is the visitor's. You obey not their words, but the grin behind them, the ancient shape carved into human memory. When leaders smile as they rob, when they laugh as they betray, the infection spreads across nations, deeper than any law. Entertainers perform the same ritual, though gilded with glamour. Stage lights blind, music pounds, and the performer beams a grin too large, too persistent, too forced. Crowds respond instinctively, smiling back, their mouths moving before their minds even catch up. This is not entertainment. It is rehearsal. It is the ritual of obedience replayed until it carves grooves into the human soul. Technology has only deepened the wound. Look at the faces on your screens. Endless streams of people grinning, rehearsed, filtered, repeated. Smiles in advertisements, smiles in films, smiles in the images you scroll without pause. The visitor thrives in the replication of its mask. Every photo, every emoji, every laughing clip is another seed planted in the soil of your mind. And have you noticed? The more the world decays, the more the smiles multiply. In times of famine, war, collapse, the leaders grin harder, the media beams brighter, the performers laugh louder. The worse the silence becomes, the wider the grin spreads. This is no accident. It is design. The visitor does not feast on your joy. It feasts on your surrender, and the grin is its hook. The Kentucky nuns were not the end of the story. They were only a moment when the mask slipped when the ritual was exposed. But the infection did not die with them. It grew, adapting, moving from convent to capital, from coffin to camera. The coffins that smiled were warnings, not relics. They told you, this is what comes. This is what waits. And so I ask you, when you see the endless smiles around you, do you believe they are signs of joy? Or do you finally see them for what they are? Rituals performed unconsciously, obedience rehearsed until the mask becomes indistinguishable from the face beneath. There's a reason you feel uneasy when a smile lingers too long. A reason you distrust the grin of a stranger who shows teeth, but no warmth in the eyes. Your instincts are not wrong. You're not paranoid. That unease is older than language. It is the part of you that remembers. The first humans knew this. They taught their children, beware the smile without reason. Beware the laugh without breath. Beware the one who grins when all others mourn. But time erodes memory, and what was once warning became tradition. Now we are told to smile at all times, to strangers, to employers, to audiences, to cameras. The visitor has reshaped instinct into expectation. What once was shield is now weapon. Think of the funeral smile. Politicians and priests alike gather at the graves of soldiers, of leaders, of victims, and though the air is thick with grief, someone always smiles. They tell you it is dignity, it is hope, it is courage. But look closer. It is the same grin that followed the Kentucky nuns into their coffins, the same arc carved into stone in forgotten caves, the same expression that stretches across every culture, every empire, every ruin. The ritual has adapted to modern forms, but the core remains. The grin binds, the grin commands, the grin erases. You are taught to obey the smiling teacher, the smiling leader, the smiling face on a screen. And in time, you no longer know whether the smile belongs to them or to the visitor wearing them. Even you're not free. How many times have you forced the grin against your will, against your truth? How many times have you smiled when you wanted to scream? How many times have you laughed while dying inside? Every forced grin is a prayer to the visitor. Every laugh without joy is a confession of obedience. And every time you obey, it grows stronger. You think the nuns were victims, but in truth, they were pioneers. They showed us what happens when obedience is perfected, when the grin fuses with flesh, when the visitor no longer needs to hide behind ritual. Their faces in death were not accidents. They were blueprints. They showed what you will become if you surrender entirely, a mask that smiles forever, with or without you inside it. Do you feel it now? That faint twitch at the corner of your lips, the pressure in your cheeks, the unspoken command to mimic what you despise. That is the inheritance. That is the parasite. That is the visitor. And it is closer than you think. It begins in the smallest places where you least expect it. Not in palaces, not in churches, but in the silence of your own home. A child sits at a table, drawing in silence. The parent asks what they are making, and the child looks up with a grin too wide, eyes fixed, the paper filled not with shapes of play, but with mouths, rows and rows of mouths. The parent laughs it off, nervous, unsettled, but the grin lingers long after the crayons are put away. That child grows, carrying the grin like a shadow, smiling in photographs, in classrooms, in nightmares. No one remembers when it began. No one remembers when it will stop. A husband wakes in the night to find his wife staring at him in the dark, teeth showing, lips curved in sleep. He shakes her, panicked, but she does not wake. The smile deepens. Her breathing continues, steady, calm, as though something else is wearing her flesh while she dreams. Days later, he begins to mirror her, grinning unconsciously in the mirror, grinning at his meals, grinning at his own reflection until the sight of his teeth feels no longer his. Families hide it. They joke about creepy smiles, about bad dreams, about photographs where everyone looks wrong. But the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. The visitor does not wait outside anymore. It is inherited, passed silently like blood, like bone. Every family carries its echo, a smile that does not belong to them, a grin that appears at funerals, at arguments, at moments where joy should never exist. Look closer at the photographs in your own house, the ones framed in halls, stored in boxes, posted online. Look long enough, and you will see it, the one face that grins too wide, too early, too wrong. That is not accident. That is not lighting. That is the visitor showing itself for a fraction of a second, testing the mask, ensuring you have not forgotten who truly owns your face. Dreams are another doorway. The Kentucky nuns were said to appear in the sleep of villagers long after their convent burned, standing at the foot of beds, their smiles glowing faintly in the dark. Children woke screaming. Adults woke weeping. Some never woke at all. Their deaths were called illness, heart failure, coincidence. But those who saw the bodies knew. The lips were curved, even in rigor. And here is the truth you will not want to hear. It is not confined to them. The visitor has walked through your dreams too, perhaps in shadows you could not recognize, perhaps in grins that chased you through corridors without end. You told yourself it was imagination, but imagination does not leave your lips twitching when you wake. Imagination does not make your jaw ache from clenching teeth you did not remember bearing. You're not immune. None of us are. The infection does not shout. It whispers. It does not strike all at once. It seeps. You notice it first in gatherings. A dinner with friends, a wedding, a meeting. Someone laughs, someone smiles too hard, and suddenly the entire room bends into mimicry. Even you, against your will, find yourself grinning. The sound of laughter spreads like static. For a moment, you forget what began it. For a moment, you forget yourself. That is how it moves, from one mouth to another, from one face to the next. It creeps into intimacy too. Lovers stare into each other's eyes, and what should be tenderness turns uncanny when one smile lingers too long, too rigid. The other mirrors it without knowing why, and suddenly their embrace feels foreign, as though something else is present, wearing their affection like a mask. These are the moments no one speaks of, the moments people bury under jokes, under silence. But deep down they know that was not them. That was not love. That was the grin rehearsed through them. Parents pass it to children without meaning to. They tell them, smile for the camera, smile for strangers, smile even when you are sad. And the children obey, unaware that the obedience is not to the parent, but to the visitor teaching itself through them. This is why the infection endures. It does not need to conquer by force. It conquers by tradition, by culture, by habit. And when grief comes, when silence should reign, the grin surfaces stronger. Families at funerals often report photographs where everyone, despite tears, shows teeth. Some say it is a way of coping. But coping does not explain the impossible uniformity, the way every mouth curves the same, the way every eye seems vacant for just a second. These are not moments of healing. They are ceremonies, rituals of surrender carried out unconsciously. Think of the Kentucky nuns again. Their coffins did not simply hold corpses. They held the culmination of centuries of rehearsal. Their smiles were not miracles. They were warnings. The same warnings you now see in photographs, in dreams, in moments of intimacy where you no longer recognize yourself. And when the moment comes, when you catch yourself smiling without knowing why, you will understand. You will know the visitor has been with you all along, waiting patiently for your surrender. And the day you stop resisting, the day you embrace the grin without thought, is the day you become another vessel, another mask that smiles forever. You have followed the trail this far, through coffins and convents, through carvings older than memory, through governments, rituals, families, and your own reflection. You know now what most never dare to admit. The visitor is not a myth, not a relic, not a fragment of history. It is here. It is in you. It has always been. Think carefully about the faces you will see after this moment. The cashier handing you change, grinning without warmth. The stranger on the street nodding, lips parted, teeth showing. The photograph of your loved ones, some smile natural, others too perfect, too wide. You will not look at them the same again. You cannot. The mask is exposed. And with your own face, when you next pass a mirror, will you see yourself? Or will you see it watching through you, a mouth already learning its permanence? Do not test it in the silence of night. Do not stare too long, for mirrors are the easiest doorway. They do not only reflect, they invite. The Kentucky nuns were not accidents. They were not saints. They were messages, flesh turned into scripture. Their coffins grinned because their obedience was complete. The visitor wore them fully, and their smiles endured past death, carved into eternity. That is the future it promises you, the destiny it whispers every time you are told to smile when you wish to cry, every time you laugh when you wish to scream. But here is the secret buried even deeper. It is not invincible. It thrives only when unspoken, only when hidden. Silence is its shield. Secrecy is its weapon. Now that you have seen it, it cannot fully hide. It will resist. It will test you. It will claw at your lips when you try to hold them still. But the act of seeing, of naming, of knowing, it wounds it. Knowledge is poison to the visitor. Memory is the crack in its mask. This is why these words matter. This is why this knowledge has been buried, burned, silenced across ages. Because the moment one voice dares to reveal it, others begin to see. The infection falters. The masks slip. The grins grow brittle. That is why the convent was erased. That is why artifacts were hidden. That is why even now, you will feel the twitch in your lips, the tightening in your jaw, as it tries to make you dismiss these truths with a laugh, a smile, a grin. Do not obey. Instead, pass it on, not as a joke, not as entertainment, but as a wound in secrecy. Speak of the coffins that smiled. Speak of the faces in stone. Speak of the visitor, the grin that has no owner. Do not let the silence return. But understand this. Once you know, you are marked. The visitor does not forgive those who expose it. Tonight, when you sleep, you may feel it standing at the foot of your bed, the grin faint in the dark. Do not look directly. Do not move. Let it pass. For if you meet its eyes, it will know you are ready. You are no longer innocent. You are no longer blind. You carry forbidden knowledge now, and that is both shield and curse. Some will mock you. Some will call you paranoid. That is the visitor speaking through them, silencing, suppressing, laughing at the wound you have carved in its mask. Hold firm. Hold silent. Do not return the grin. If you are still here, if you have not looked away, if you have resisted the twitch at your lips through all these words, then you are already stronger than most. But strength is only preserved by ritual. You must seal it. Share this knowledge, but do so carefully, as though handing fire through darkness. Do not let it die in your silence. Now listen closely. If you can still feel the visitor stirring in you, if you feel your lips fighting to curve, your teeth pressing against your own will, then you must act. Seal this truth as the ancients did, not with prayer, not with laughter, but with the mark of secrecy. Comment below, as if writing in a stone, not once but twice, the phrase, "The smile is not mine." Do it twice, and the act becomes more than ritual. It becomes declaration. It becomes resistance. And the visitor hates resistance. Remember the title history tried to bury: the nuns who smiled from their coffins. Their silence was their prison. But you are not silent anymore. The coffins were warnings. The coffins were mirrors. And now that you know, you are carrying the same reflection. What you do next will decide whether your smile belongs to you or to the visitor that waits for all of us in the end. Subscribe if you would hear more of what others fear to say. Comment to mark your resistance. Share to pass the wound wider, to crack the mask in places the visitor has never expected. But do so as though carrying something forbidden, because that is exactly what it is. You have seen too much to return. You cannot unhear it. You cannot unsee it. And when you look into a coffin one day, and the lips are curved and the teeth gleam, you will remember these words, and you will understand. The visitor is smiling, and it is smiling through you.